Now some congratulations. Congratulations to Dan Puchniak from Singapore Management University for winning the prize for the best paper in 2022 in the Law Working Paper series. His paper is titled "No Need for Asia to be Woke, Contextualizing Anglo-America's Discovery," quote unquote, of corporate purpose. I don't want to steal Dan's thunder, so I won't tell you anything about it. But I will say that we had a pretty easy job picking up selecting Dan's paper. We zeroed in on it rather quickly. Here, to a great degree, it's also thanks to the rules that Luca has devised. Among ourselves, I should tell you, we refer to him as Luca the Founder, with a capital F. So it works very well, and with Dan's paper, it was really quick. Substantively, let me just point out two points, two subjects in Dan's paper that I found particularly important or interesting, because it doesn't just make the argument, but also backs it with a solid proof. I mean, the way we lawyers prove things, it's quite different from the way you do. But it's not just mere hand waving, okay? So even for lawyers, that's a major achievement to be able to make a case not only with hand waving. So 2 points. One of them was already invoked in this conference more than once. And here I quote briefly, Asia demonstrates that different jurisdictions have different understandings of the purpose that corporations should serve, and there is no one model that fits all. So this, by now, I think we will agree, has already become an instant classic, right? We saw this yesterday and in the Young Scholar workshop as well. The second point that comes immediately afterwards is, and here, again, I'm quoting also, at any given time, each jurisdiction will have a different point along the shareholder primacy stakeholderism continuum. And here I feel personally related to this point, which I think is substantively important as well, not just personally, because some years ago in joint work with Renee Adams and Lilach Sagiv, I believe we were the first to use the terms stakeholderism and shareholderism with the ism suffix to denote an ideology-like approach to the subject or the issue of corporate purpose, at least with regard to shareholders and stakeholders and their role in the corporation. So I'm delighted that it finds some traction in further work. Dan's work shows, I think, that those concepts indeed form an axis-like structure, a continuum in which different individuals, or in Dan's work's case, national level systems of corporate governance map onto this axis. So there are degrees of shareholderism versus stakeholderism. It doesn't have to be an extreme position on either case. Finally, a few words about Dan, if I may. In my mind, at least, Dan personifies everything that the ECGI aspires for. He's a prolific author of high-level, high-quality legal research on corporate governance. His work is both topical and innovative, and his prize-winning paper is evidence to that. And Dan's work, along with the work of others in ECGI, work to expand the jurisdiction, if you will, of ECGI, and also our contribution well beyond Europe to become truly global. And I'm delighted that Dan and his paper are the winners today.
Can you hear me well? Yes. with an introduction like that, yeah, I feel like the only thing I can do now is disappoint. Yeah. But of course, I have to start with thanks. Thanks to Amir and the committee. Thanks to Cleary, the sponsor. Thanks to ECGI, and of course, I'll embarrass Elaine and Marco one more time. And thanks to the Copenhagen Business School. Yeah, it's been a wonderful event. Not only the professors here, but you look around and you see this beautiful building that is spotless. Yeah. So the cleaners, the people who maintain this place, deserve an enormous thanks for giving us this venue. So how did this all start? I asked to have free hands, yeah, because I wanted to use a prop. And it's this, yeah, it's Colin's book, yeah, is the prop. And this showed up in my mailbox in Singapore in 2002. And I think if you don't have the hard copy of the book, and now I'm going to make Colin some money maybe, you should buy the hard copy, yeah, because I've told people that the hard copy, the first few pages when you flip them open, it's quite extraordinary, right? You see these CEOs, some of the top business school professors from around the world. You see a lawyer who is known to the whole legal community as one of the most prolific, sort of, I would say, quasi-academics, Marty Lipton, yeah. And if you read through, I think there's 13 in total descriptions of how important this book is. You get to hear that this is something which is going to change corporate governance around the world. Indeed, if you look at what Marty Lipton says, he says that this is the Bible of corporate governance that is destined to change the world. I added the emphasis in terms of world. Why was this seen in 2018 to be so groundbreaking? It was seen to be so groundbreaking because the idea was that for decades, indeed for half a century, the focus and the understanding of the purpose of the corporation, at least the way the story is told and understood, was to maximize shareholder value. And what Prosperity put forward, and put forward with a wonderful, dare I say, purpose and intention, was to do good in the world by waking everybody up to this idea that corporations should no longer be governed for the sole purpose of maximizing shareholder value. As this was seen, it was a new discovery. And this wasn't just a book, it was more than that. You get the very next year, the Business Roundtable in the United States. For those of you who are unfamiliar, I'm sure most of you are, the Business Roundtable is a group of the elite CEOs in the United States who come together. And for years, they had been resistant about changing their view of corporate purpose. Quite insistent that corporate purpose was about maximizing shareholder value. In 2019, that changed dramatically, and it changed in a way that made headlines around the world. And what did they change their statement to say? They changed their statement to say that corporations no longer exist principally to serve shareholders, but for the benefit of all stakeholders, customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. Almost as if taken out of the pages, I dare say, of the Prosperity book. The very next year, you have Of course, people all recognize probably who this is. You have Larry Fink. And Larry Fink wrote a letter. Again, the letter was not to CEOs in the United States. It was to CEOs around the world, essentially saying the same thing, that the whole world needs to become more purposeful in its approach. It has to adopt stakeholderism in its approach. And then you had, in the same year, the World Economic Forum. At the end of the forum, as other people have described in their academic work, there was a manifesto that was produced. And in this manifesto, what it said is that shareholder capitalism needed to be changed or almost abandoned. Some people called this the funeral of shareholder capitalism. Again, what is the idea here? The idea here was that the whole world has been obsessed with this idea of the corporation only having one purpose, which is maximizing shareholder value. There has been a new discovery now that we are going to change the way things are done to embrace other purposes beyond maximizing shareholder value towards a more stakeholder approach. Why would we do this? And Prosperity, along with a number of other scholars, make fairly, I would say, large promises as to how this may turn out well for everyone. Now, I put this up because using the language in the book, the idea was if you get rid of this Friedman, this Friedman doctrine, and the Friedman doctrine, for anybody who's unfamiliar, is the idea that corporations should focus on maximizing shareholder value. If you get rid of this, then, as it is said in the book, we have the possibility for a new golden age. Now, why do I put this picture up? Because, as it's said in Prosperity, we may reach corporate nirvana, to quote. Yes. And indeed, this idea that Friedman had influenced the world is something which people have held on to. And again, quoting from the book, the Friedman doctrine has been a powerful concept that has defined business practice and government policies around the world, my emphasis added, for half a century. When I picked up the book, I was excited. I'm a huge believer in change. As you'll see, I think climate is incredibly important. However, I had my reservations when I sat in Singapore and read this about the Friedman doctrine. 3 words popped into my mind, which you'll see in the introduction of my article: not so fast. Yeah. Now, what do I mean by that? Not so fast. Well, I don't have a quibble with the fact that in Anglo-America, in the US and the UK, that over the last several decades, maybe even half a century, you have had a movement towards a doctrine and law that has been very much guided by shareholder primacy and the purpose of maximizing shareholder value. That part is correct. Indeed, at the dawn of the new millennium, there was a paper called The End of History for Corporate Law by Henry Hansman and Rainer Crackman, 2 terrific scholars. Okay, I don't know, they wrote a follow-up paper, right? I'm not sure if they would like to use the same title again. I'm not here to debate whether it was the beginning of time or the end of history. But that is something for UK and US scholars to debate. But they did predict that the world would move to this shareholder primacy model as well. Sitting in Singapore, I was a bit confused. And I was confused because if you look at the success story in Asia, and Asia's success has been global success. Asia and the success stories that have happened have changed societies that were destroyed in the war to working places. In Asia, you've had hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty. In Asia, you have had places like Singapore not only catch up to the West, but start to accelerate beyond it. The question is, have they done this for decades because they were obsessed with the Friedman Doctrine? Have they done this with a purposeful approach based on the purpose being the maximization of shareholder value? You can guess from my quote on the screen, which I say in the paper, what seems to have been forgotten is that the Friedman Doctrine is as autochthonous to Asia as the fortune cookie. For those of you who don't know, when you eat a fortune cookie at a Chinese restaurant, you can thank the people either in California or New York. Yes, this is not a creation of the Chinese. Yes, just like the Friedman Doctrine is an American doctrine that has had huge influence in the United States, in the United Kingdom. But it is not the basis of what has went on in Asia. In fact, I will take you on a whirlwind tour in the 20 minutes I have left through Asia. And on the tour, what you will see is that Asia has been steeped in an idea of purpose beyond maximizing shareholder value. That has been at the core of the legal system in Asia. You will also see that this idea of stakeholders has been at the core. Now, am I just engaging in an ivory tower back and forth? That is not my goal here. My goal here is to avoid serious problems. Again, the purpose movement coming out of Anglo-America was done with the best of intentions. But I think there are serious, practical problems that have already arisen because of saying that the whole world needs to follow one approach to purpose. And I will give you those examples. And there's more harm that can be done by this. So this is not just a correction of history, but rather it has very much a practical application for the problems we're trying to address, including climate. So where to begin? I start with China. Yeah? Even the raising of the Chinese flag evokes today different feelings among different people. There's probably not a more polarizing geopolitical issue these days than talking about China. You have very pro-China people and very anti-China people. I try to consider myself hopefully objective, trying to look at both sides. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I'm not a human rights expert, but I'm also not going to say that's not important. It's very important. But I'm not talking about that today. I will give you some important statistics that are undeniable about what has happened in China over the last 20 years from an economic point of view. If you look at global Fortune 500 companies and you go back 20 years, you find almost none in China. On my last count, in a paper I did for institutional investors in China, you now have more global Fortune 500 companies in China than the United States and all of Europe combined. You go back 20 years, you look at the league tables in terms of stock market capitalization. China's hardly on them. Now it's clearly second in the world, shooting for the US at first. You look at 5G technology, you look at drone technology, the list can go on. Chinese companies have had a huge amount of economic success. Now, what's the trade-off? That's a different story. But that success is there. Now the question is, have they done this through the Friedman Doctrine? The answer to this question is quite clear. You go back to 2002 and you look at the Code of Corporate Governance. Now it's interesting, not only in the Prosperity book, but in many pieces of scholarship, people, and I've even said this on occasion, that codes of corporate governance spread the shareholder primacy UK model around the world. So I was quite surprised when I found myself what the Chinese, when they adopted it in 2002, you may have thought this is going to bring shareholder primacy to China. But what does it actually say? It said that companies should be concerned with the welfare, environmental protection, public interest of the community, and pay attention to the company's social responsibilities. This is in 2002, not 2022. It's almost taken out of the book today. Then you go to 2018, the Chinese release another code of corporate governance. What does it say companies should do? They should actively implement the concept of green development, integrate ecological and environmental protection requirements into the development strategy and ecological civilization, and play an exemplary role in pollution prevention, resource conservation, and ecological protection. If that's not purposeful enough, they say that companies should help poverty-stricken counties or villages and actively connect with and earnestly support poverty-stricken areas to develop local industries, train talents, and promote employment. If you give me another year, I cannot write a more purposeful statement. Now, the problem in China is not that they don't understand purpose. The leader of China now, Xi Jinping, understands very well how to cajole companies to help out after a natural disaster. He understands very well how to tell tech companies what their purpose is. Is that good? Is that bad? It's another debate. What you can't tell me is that China needs to be woken up to the idea that companies have purposes other than maximizing shareholder value. In fact, I would say any serious China scholar, even the pro-China people, will say that at this moment in time, China wants to move the needle back on that continuum that Amir talked about. Move the needle back towards what? Towards less purpose, towards focusing on more shareholder value. Whether you're worried about Chinese companies being productive or you're worried about the CCP using this as a conduit to maintain their authoritarian power, both sides will say you move the needle not towards more purpose. You move it towards focusing on the goal of shareholder value. I showed this picture in Japan less than 2 months ago. I asked the audience, where was this picture taken and when was it taken? It's a horrific picture. I was surprised that at Tokyo University, nobody immediately offered the answer. A few people talked to me afterwards and they told me that a few admitted that they didn't think it was Japan. A few said to me that they knew it was Japan, but they thought it was Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It's not. It's Tokyo. More people died in the Tokyo firebombing immediately than died in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Now again, I did my graduate work in Japan. I've taught for the last 7 years a course, comparative corporate commercial course at Tokyo University. I've also taught at Seoul National University. Asia is a very complicated place. There's very serious issues about World War II, and I'm not going to broach any of those in this short time. Why I'm raising this picture is for an economic point. You look at Japan and you look at Tokyo. The picture I showed you was Tokyo then, just before the end of the war. This is Tokyo now. Michael Spence has a book, The Next Convergence. Has a terrific part in the book where he says he looked at economic history, and Japan was the first country ever, according to him, in the history of the world, not modern history, he went back to the Industrial Revolution, to ever achieve a growth rate of doubling its economy in under a decade. And it did it multiple times. And the rest of Asia has looked to that example, and that has been replicated. But the question we have for purpose is, what was the model? And Julian Franks yesterday, he talked about this period. I see this period very differently. He said this was a period where there was not, shareholder value didn't increase and this was not productive. You look at this period, and Japan transformed itself to a society at the end of 1989. Not only was it on many measures the richest country in the world, but in terms of safety, community standards, many metrics, okay, a very well-functioning company. At the backbone of this, what was it? Corporate Japan. And corporate Japan, does any serious Japanese scholar say that they were following a shareholder primacy model? They will laugh. They do laugh. What was going on in Japan was something where shareholders had almost no voice. It was employee-centered. It was called the company community. It was very egalitarian at that time. Gini coefficient was exceptionally low, okay? And by not recognizing this history properly, we are actually canceling out one of the best historical examples of purposeful success. Not total success. There are problems in Japan like there are problems everywhere else. The lifetime employment system has produced something called karoshi, which means working to death, essentially. It's legally recognized. It's not a perfect system, but I would challenge anybody to say that that period of time was not a very well-functioning time. That was a very purposeful approach. Now, the response to me will be, well, the bubble burst. And the bubble did burst. And I could spend another 2 hours talking about the legal reforms that have been made since the bubble burst to try to push Japan from this managerial-centered lifetime system and push the needle, again, to use Amir's continuum and what I propose at the end of the paper, to push the needle more towards a shareholder approach. In my opinion, and many, Japan needs this. Why? You have basically still, even after all of these reforms, okay, hostile takeovers, unwinding of cross-shareholding, independent directors didn't show up until 2014, despite many attempts. But the boards are still dominated mainly by old men who are fearful that their company community will fail, risk-averse, sitting on piles of cash. We know that the Tokyo Stock Exchange has a number of companies where asset value, okay, is on a collective fire sale basis less than share price. What do they need? Do they need more purpose? In fact, purpose has been used for something completely unexpected. They passed a stewardship code. My good colleague and friend Gen Goto at Tokyo University has produced a great paper explaining how the stewardship code was designed to do exactly the opposite of what it was designed to do in the UK. It was done to force you towards a more shareholder-centric approach, to cause them to take more risk. Remember, in the UK, it was done to cause them to take less risk. Exactly the opposite. Now, what is the risk of this purpose movement? Another risk is the Kishida administration. Everybody listens to the global language. And if you talk to executives in Japan, what do you hear? There was a fear, in fact, The Economist ran an article about this, a fear that the Kishida administration was going to use purpose. There's an old Edo phrase that they dug up, sanpo yoshi. Okay, three-way success, buyer, seller, community. And they pull this out now, and they say, perhaps we don't have to make these hard reforms. Okay. This is dangerous. India. India is this enormous potential of success. Now passing China in population, but it's not just raw population that excites me about India. It's the fact that they have 5 million people working in tech. They have 100 unicorn companies. Last year, they had the largest or fastest growth rate of any major economy. Now, what is the difference, if you ask any lawyer, what is the comparative difference between Japan and China and India? If you could pick out one thing, what will people say? Lawyers will say, it's common law, civil law. So you may think that India, being a common law, Commonwealth country, absorbed the UK, and they've taken this shareholder primacy approach. Now, I have to give all the credit to who I consider to be the best Indian corporate law scholar in the world, my dear friend Umakant Veritil at NUS. Yeah, this is all him channeled through me. Yeah, and if you ask Umakant, I did ask Umakant, how do they see purpose in India? It's very simple. It's not complicated. India has always seen the company as a socio-economic institution. Indeed, the Supreme Court came out with a very clear decision in the 80s about this. Not only do they rely on the judicial decisions, to just reinforce the point, in 2013, they passed Section 166 of the New Companies Act. And if you read it, some common law lawyers could confuse it because they'll say, oh, this is just like the UK. It's not like the UK. If you read the language, it doesn't say that shareholders enlighten shareholders. No. It says that shareholders are on par. It's a pluralistic view. Directors have duties to shareholders. They have duties to employees. They have duties to the community. They have duties to protect the environment on par. Yes. India also put in a provision 10 years ago where they require large companies to give 2% to corporate social responsibility. Has this solved the problems in India? What's the major problem in India? The major problem is you have elites who are controlling shareholders, and they use their control to tunnel the wealth out of companies, which is not good for planet or person or India at all. Now, how does this relate to corporate purpose? Well, they've been very purposeful. But what's going to solve the problem in India? It's not going to be to increase the 2% to 4% or 6% of corporate social responsibility. That is not going to solve the problem. The problem may be a more laser focus, actually, trying to pin down the directors to one thing that you can hold them accountable on. Okay? And that probably is actually more moving the needle towards shareholder maximization. My last example is Singapore. My son was born there. It's my adopted home for 15 years. For those of you who haven't visited, please come. It's an extraordinary place. It's extraordinary because I think few people realize it caught up to Japan in GDP per person in 1990. These are the latest World Bank statistics. It's now significantly higher than the United States, higher than Switzerland, higher than every G7 country. Yeah. You know, the pictures tell the stories. I found this nice picture of a piece of land on Independence, the same piece of land a decade ago. Very Anglo-American. I was at Cambridge a few days ago talking about this, and the lawyers were a bit, I think some people afterwards I talked to them were a bit surprised. And this won't mean anything to non-lawyers, but it will mean something to the lawyers in the room. You cannot find one Singapore decision, I'm not talking Supreme Court, I'm talking any level of court, where a company law decision that does not cite another jurisdiction. Probably about 80% cite the UK, okay, then Canada or Australia. It's very common law. Okay. So you may say, well, then Singapore is your counterexample. It's an example of a success which maybe was built on this Friedman doctrine. Yeah. And indeed, Singapore has these fascinating companies. In the interest of time, I can't go through them. Yeah, but just remarkable companies that, Singtel, I always ask students, how many customers do you think it has? Of course, they always say under 6 million because Singapore only has 6 million. It's a bit of a trick question. Singtel has 500-600 million customers, yeah. It owns 23 telephone carriers, one of Australia's 2 major telephone carriers. So there's these extraordinary companies. And if you read the law, yes, out of context, if you read the law, just read the law, what are you going to come away with? You're going to say, this is just like enlightened shareholder value. But what is Temasek? Temasek is the largest shareholder in almost all of Singapore's largest capitalized companies. Who's the shareholder of Temasek? It's the Singapore government. Is this what Friedman thought of? That the government is going to be the biggest shareholder in a country where 85% of people live in public housing? But then when you go down to the firm level, what do you find in Singapore? You find that the government has set up an institutional architecture, which I write about in another paper, to separate out politics from the boardroom, to make sure that the boardroom focuses on profit, because they know that around the world, government companies have been dominated by political purpose. And in that context, you see the risk. If Singapore is woken up to purpose, they could lose this critical advantage. So I'm not here to say that Friedman is right, Mayer is wrong. Mayer is right, Friedman is wrong. That is not the point of this exercise at all. This exercise is to say, as Amir perfectly put at the beginning in a much clearer way than I've expressed so far, that it's all about context. Yes? That context matters. And if you don't understand the context, there is enormous risk. If the message is that we have one solution for the whole world, every company needs to become more purposeful, as well-meaning as that may be, it can be terribly abused. And may I dare say that when I present this in Asia, the feeling of colonialism comes out. Yeah. And so that is the risk. And the approach is exactly what Amir said. We don't have shareholderism or shareholders and stakeholders. Every company in every country has shareholders, and every company has stakeholders. The real question is how, when you figure out the US and the UK are over here on the shareholder side, Asian countries over here on the stakeholder side, and through time they'll move back and forth. The question is, how do you respond to that? How do you make real legal change to make the companies produce? And this is incredibly important for climate change. In Japan, Japanese companies have this enormous potential, creative potential to address climate change. But they need that push from shareholders to get the old guard out and to start doing some more innovative things. China, if it keeps on going down this Xi Jinping more and more pushing his purposes, this is not going to end well in my estimation for China. It is not going to end well either for the world. And so we need to understand how this context works. So I'm 1 minute over time. I apologize, I will end. Yeah? But I end with this. The key to all of this, I think, is that yes, we want prosperity. But in order to achieve prosperity in a world where context matters, prosperity requires diversity. Thank you very much.
History will tell.
Dan, congratulations. I can't think of a paper that is better suited to a conference on modern capitalism and corporate purpose, and one that's more emblematic of what ECGI stands for, global, really nuanced, deep research. So thank you very much for presenting that to us. Oh, yeah, do we have any Q&A for Dan or for Amir? But mainly for Dan, I think. Do we still have our finance guys online or no? So it's just questions for Dan, if anyone would like. Yeah.
Yeah, Dan, thank you for that stimulating conversation. I've really got my mind moving, and it's humbling as a Westerner. My question is, if the Asian corporations have been working with this stakeholderism idea for a lot longer, the premise might be that they may be in a better position to deal with this existential threat around environmental degradation. If you had to pick an Asian country that's going to lead in responding to this existential threat, which country might that be?
You can turn off the recording because I'm sure I'll get this wrong. It's a terrific question. It's also a geopolitical question, of course, right? But I love your question, in fact. I think this is what the world wants to know about. In terms of leadership, I can tell you that from a regulatory point of view, and I guess my colleagues in Singapore and the Singapore government who, in full disclosure, I've been involved in the committee to suggest reforms to the Singapore Companies Act. I've set the company law exam for the country. So, I have huge respect. And Singapore wants to see itself as a hub to spread out all of the knowledge in Asia, and they're doing a good job at that. But you have to be realistic. Singapore has 3 million citizens and 3 million expats. It's not going to be the major leader. It's the first time I've thought about your question, but if you're going to think about it, you have to nail it down to India, China, or Japan. India has a lot more work to do. I hope that it does what Japan did and what China's done and what Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore has done, but India's had fits and starts, and it needs to get that right. So I don't see India at this point in time being in the position to lead, which leaves you with the second and third largest economies in the world, which are China and Japan. Japan, of course, was second largest for a long time and has now been overtaken by China. And Japan has a lot of deep roots in ASEAN. ASEAN isn't talked about much. It's 600 million people. It's growing at a rate of 6 to 7%, and incredibly important. And if you look at investment, so I've been involved a lot with Japanese firms and academic institutions in ASEAN. So Japan is trying to galvanize ASEAN, and it's done some good work in ASEAN, but ASEAN's a complicated place as well. If Japan can make that work, maybe. But to be very honest, China with 1.4 billion and its production capacity, you look at the #1 EV market in the world, it's easily China, you look at all of these markets, you look at the battery market for making the batteries, and I'm not an engineer, but I have good friends who are engineers, and and many friends and colleagues at Peking University in Tsinghua. China has built these plants to create the most sophisticated batteries, and it will take years to catch up. So I think China really is the issue of the day. And it's unfortunate because China has become so polarized and so politicized that I fear the understanding of it is difficult to achieve. It's very difficult to have a nuanced conversation about China. Even when I give my statistics at the beginning, you can see sometimes people an immediate negative reaction or an immediate positive reaction. But China is an extremely complicated place. I put out with my colleague Lin at NUS a paper on institutional investors in China. BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, big three, they don't exist. They own like the smallest fraction. So I had a very simple question. I said to my colleague Lin, let's talk about, so go find I don't speak Mandarin. I said to her, go find the Chinese literature on this, the Mandarin. She said there's no analysis. So we decided to write up this paper to figure it out. I was shocked. Institutional investors have moved from 2% to 20%. Everybody knows that the government, everybody knows the SOE story. But do you actually know who the BlackRock, State Streets, and Fidelity of China are? Do you actually know whether they're owned by the state or they're private? Do you know that the private ones, the levers of power? So China, I think, is the answer. But I would say the amount of serious research that needs to be done now on China and the US, of course, I have huge respect for the academic institutions there, unbelievable. But now it's getting very difficult in the United States to dig down into China. That is terribly unfortunate because you have some of the brightest, most sophisticated people, and it's compromised. So I would say the answer is China, but it's a huge project to try to unpack it. And I think ECGI hopefully will expand to Asia. And I've actually just started an organization called the Asia Corporate Law Forum. And I'm happy to say that both Peking University and Taiwan National University are involved in the organization. Yes, and it's going to be a terrific thing. But I think we need to drill down into that.
Just going on with that question, just quickly, and then I'll go to Colin. You know, you pointed out the role of institutional investors, and of course that differs greatly across Asia. It's very small, is my understanding, in Singapore. But I think there's been a lot more shareholder activism in the ESG space in Japan, is my understanding. Is that right? Just if you could say something about institutional investment across Asia, and then it's Colin.
So actually, I had the pleasure of doing an interview with The Economist for a piece they did on shareholder activism in Asia. And they were trying to frame the piece, and they were kind enough to cite some of the research from the ECGI blog, which I have to give a cheer out to, yes. And I felt very bad because they mentioned one of my papers with Gen Goto and Alan Coe. But to be very honest, the Korean part was from the blog. And so June from Seoul National University, actually, there was a lot of actually other academics that The Economist I could see. It's just we got lucky and they decided to mention our name. But The Economist asked me, and Jennifer, you're absolutely right. They said, can you give us, because it's a short piece, right? We don't need all the, they were getting very frustrated with me because I was trying to give so much nuance. They said, okay, we only have a short piece here. But can you give me any bifurcations in Asia that we can sort of make a taxonomy out of? And one of the bifurcations you've touched on, which is I think you have to separate out, and this goes back to the panel yesterday, which I loved, on shareholder structure. And Colin's done great work on this, actually, with Julian, right, and his Japanese colleagues. Shareholder structure in Japan, on a comparative basis, is so different from the rest of Asia. Now, why? Because after the war, there's a whole legal history behind it. But your end result is you take the top 100 or 1,000 firms on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and you have almost no big block shareholders. Everywhere else in Asia, you cannot say that. Okay, the only other places you can say it to that extent are actually the UK and the US. So I think, why does shareholder activism, you see a lot now about activism in Japan, it's because empirically you have the possibility for a hostile takeover. Empirically, you have the possibility for institutional investors to show up and gather votes at meetings and do something. What happens in Singapore? In Singapore, you get the BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, and all the Singaporean institutional investors together, and they show up at the AGM, they have 6%. And who's sitting on the other side of the table? The Singapore government with 51%. Good luck. So activism, right? Activism is very different. And it comes down to shareholder structure. And Japan you hear a lot about because the structure is so different because of this historical legal difference which came out of World War II.
Colin.
I'd just like to say then that I think this is a tremendous paper, and I absolutely agree with everything that you say in it. And indeed, it's precisely the message that I hope that Prosperity is conveying. Because the last message it's trying to convey is that there is one model for the world. Its primary message is plurality, multiplicity of purposes, and in particular the notion of balancing solving problems with making money and making profit, and hence the notion of profitable solutions. So, the picture you present of diversity is exactly the one that I think is the appropriate description. And indeed, it's much more than what you're just saying. It's not just Asia, it's continental Europe in many respects, as against UK, US. So there's a great degree of variation across the world, which one wants to encourage, if only to promote experimentation. So my question is, in regard to the balance, the message that I heard you, I think, saying in relation to Japan is that you still feel it hasn't gone far enough, and that the reforms that have been very much along the lines of market directions need to go further. And the question is, do you think that there is a point at which they should say, actually, one shouldn't go further, because it risks undermining some of the benefits associated with the distinctive structure of the Japanese system. So I'd welcome your views on that.
So just three very quick responses or reactions. Firstly, to Colin, personally, this prosperity book is started this conversation really, and it was intended for good, and it's producing good, and I have enormous respect for the initiative and what it has done, and it's now time for people to drill down. And I'm sure you'll be drilling down even in subsequent projects, right? So I really like that you've said that. You've anticipated my next paper, which the title will not be surprising. So Georg Ringe, Aurelio Guerrero Martinez, and I have pledged to write a paper called "No Need for the World to Be Woke." And it is precisely that. Actually, I feel very guilty. Georg delivered the German part a long time ago, and I haven't had time to get around to it. But your point is 100% spot on. We're going to also look at emerging economies, and we're going to Latin America, Aurelio Guerrero Martinez, and Georg is going to do the continent. And you're absolutely right. 100% what you say, that will be the driving force between no world to be woke. Your third intuition, I also am in 100% agreement with. It would be a disaster for Japan to transform and transplant into the US or the UK. That is not what I am proposing at all. I'm proposing a contextualized approach where Japan figures out certain solutions. Now, do they need a bit more of a push? Yes. But you're talking to somebody who has published a paper called The Efficiency of Friendliness. Okay, I have a published article called that. Okay, so the Japanese system has many, many merits. I'm not proposing to replace Japan with the UK or the US, not by any means. I am saying that there's an old guard in Japan that, for good reason, experienced a serious, one of the biggest collapses in the market. So they built up a moat of money around them, and they're mostly quite old, and they think through one perspective, graduating from the same law schools and universities, and this needs to be shook up. You know, diversity, now, the Japanese are doing this. The Japanese aren't ignorant to this. They know that they need to put more women on boards. They know that they need to do certain things with diversity. Are they going to do that in the same way the US does? No. Is the US going to do the same way that Denmark does? No. Should Japan do it the same way? No. It's all about context. So I am not proposing at all. At some point, you will reach the limit. That's why the continuum's important. I think Japan was over here. I would propose it move a little bit more here. I don't think it should go to this extreme. I agree with you on the US and the UK. The US and the UK have been here. They need to be pushed. And you're providing the push in prosperity. And to that audience, I 100% agree with the push. And you know, so again, it comes down to the continuum. And the continuum wouldn't make sense. If you don't have the continuum, you say, make Japan into shareholder primacy. That would be the worst disaster. And if my paper ended in that, it would be awful and it would be a failure.